Mesachas Yevamos Daf Samach Vav begins the seventh parak of the Masechta, parak Alman L'Kohen Grado, and it's discussing the property that a woman brings into her marriage to a Kohen. When is that property able to eat truma, and when is that property not able to eat truma? This takes us into the broader sugya of the property that a woman brings into a marriage. How is it defined? As we shall see, there's two ways of defining the property, two potential categories in which the property a woman brings into a marriage can be defined. And based on that, the halachos of eating truma will follow for her avadim. The Gemara will first discuss how the property is defined and then get more deeply into the halachos of one of those types of properties. So let's give an introduction. Two introductions that we need to discuss is the general rules of a woman eating truma when she's married to a kohen, and the general rules of a woman bringing property. So in general, the halacha is as follows. A kohen is allowed to eat truma. A kohen's family and property is also allowed to eat truma as long as they are part of his family and his estate. So a kohen's daughter, as long as she's not married to anybody else, is allowed to eat truma based on the fact that he is her daughter. A kohen's wife is allowed to eat truma based on the fact that she is his wife, irrespective of who her father is. Once the woman leaves the marriage, then she goes back to her father's estate. If her father was Yisrael, she doesn't eat truma anymore. Now, the property of a kohen eats truma as well, and therefore the eved of a kohen eats truma as part of his rishus. Those are generally the concepts of truma. As long as someone is considered to be part of a kohen's estate, either through marriage or through birth, they eat truma. Now, if a woman is a bas Yisrael and she's married to a kohen and she dies, but she has a child from him, that child keeps her as part of the estate. She doesn't go back to her father's house as long as she has a child from her husband, and that's called that the child feeds her truma. Now, when a woman gets married and she has pre-existing property, that property can come into the marriage one of two ways. They're called nichsei malug and nichsei tzon v'arzal. Now, nichsei malug means that the property remains hers. It's hers. It belongs to her throughout the marriage. It continues to be hers as they are married, and when the marriage is dissolved, either through the death of the husband or through divorce, the property remains hers. If there's a depreciation or an increase in the value of the property, that gain or loss is hers, because she keeps the property just the way it is, in whatever state it is. That's called nichsei mulug. Now, during all this time, the husband has the right to use part of the produce, the value that's earned by the property, not the property itself, and that's in exchange for his feeding her and supporting her. Now, the property that a woman brings into a marriage can be defined differently, and that's what's called nichsei tzon barzel. And there, she brings the property into the marriage and she gives it to her husband with a specific dollar amount, with a specific evaluation. It now belongs to him, and it's recorded how much it was worth when she brought it into the marriage, and that's how much she'll get when she leaves the marriage. So if the husband dies or divorces her, she will get back her property at that specific value, at the dollar amount that it was valued at when she got it. This is called nichsei tzon barzel, which means iron sheep, because the property will remain the same when she brought it in as when she brings it out. It will not change value as far as she's concerned. If there is an increase or a decrease in the value of the property, that's the husband's value that went up or down because it belonged to him while they were married. Now, the woman has the right to choose which arrangement she wants. As usual with the woman's monetary arrangement, Chazal gave the choice to her to allow her husband to take care of her property and make monetary decisions for her, or allow her to choose to maintain her own finances. So the Mishnah discusses what is the halacha when she brings avadim into a marriage. Are those avadim able to eat truma or not? And of course it'll depend whether these avadim are mulug or tzon varzal, because that makes a difference as to who owns them. And the rule generally is going to be that if the husband owns them, and here we're referring to a bas Yisrael at first, if a bas Yisrael so let's take the simpler case first, which is at the end of the Mishnah. The Mishnah says if a bas Yisrael marries a kohen, both of them can eat truma. Then it doesn't matter who owns the avadim. It doesn't matter if they're nichsei malug and belong to the wife, or if they're nichsei tzon barzel and belong to the husband. Both are eating truma, and therefore the eved can eat truma. On the other hand, if you have a bas kohen that marries a Yisrael, neither of them are eating truma. And again, it doesn't matter who owns the eved, if they're nichsei malug or nichsei tzon barzel. None of the owners are eating truma, and therefore the avadim don't eat truma. The question comes when you have a situation in which the husband is eating truma and the woman's not. Now it depends who owns the avodim. Now what would be a situation like that? That's if the woman's a halala. The woman marries a Kohen, but she's not allowed to marry the Kohen. She's either an almana marrying a Kohen gadol or a gusha chalutza marrying a Kohen hedyot. She's a halala, she cannot eat truma, but he does. Now it depends who owns the avodim. So if it's nechsei tzom barzel, the husband owns the avodim and therefore they can eat truma. If it's nechsei malug, the woman owns the avodim and therefore they do not eat truma, just like she does not eat truma. Now, the Gemara begins, and the Gemara says, even in the case where the avodim are nechsei malug, and they belong to the woman, they should eat truma anyway. And even though the woman is not. And the reason is because the possessions of a Kohen have a right to eat truma. The Gemara shows that from a Brisa. The Brisa is a drasha based on the phrase in the pasuk describing the halachas of truma. It says, "V'kohen ki yikne nefesh kinyan kasbo, hu yochal abo." There's an extra phrase here, nefesh kinyan kasbo. What's ki yikne nefesh? When he owns a soul, was after right when he has property of a soul, when a soul becomes part of his estate, either by being his wife or by being his eved. What does it say? Kinyan kasbo. What's that extra phrase? So that extra phrase is to include when his property or when a member of his estate has property or has a member of their estate. Now, it's possible for an eved to own a property. It's a different sugya how that could happen, but it is possible that he does. So if the eved of a Kohen owns his own eved, that eved can eat truma just like his owner can. And if the wife of a Kohen owns an eved, independently of her husband, that eved can also eat truma, because we learned that the property of a Kohen can eat truma. The property of a Kohen can give the right to eat truma to her or his property. So the property of a Kohen eats truma. Therefore, the Gemara asks, even if the avodim here in this Mishnah are the property of the woman, that is, they are nechsei malug, and even though the woman's not eating truma, but they are still the property of the woman who's the estate of the Kohen, and therefore they should eat truma. So the Gemara says no. The rule that the property of a Kohen eats truma is only if the property is eating truma. That is, if the Kohen is giving the right to eat truma to a member of his estate, his wife or his eved, then that woman or eved's property gets to eat truma as well. Here, however, the woman doesn't eat truma, so her eved cannot eat truma. So the Gemara is going to give three approaches to explain this. This is the first approach, that since the woman can't eat truma, she doesn't give the right to eat truma to her eved. So there's a problem with that. The Gemara says because we have situations in which the property of a Kohen cannot eat truma, but their property does eat truma. Where do you see that? So the Gemara says, for example, let's say you have a Kohen who's an Orel, a Kohen who does not have a bris milah. He cannot eat truma because he doesn't have a bris milah, yet his property is allowed to eat truma. So you can't tell me that you can only give the power to eat truma if you yourself have the power to eat truma, because here you have the Kohen without a bris who does not have the power to eat, and yet he gives the power to eat. So the Gemara says the same thing applies to Tameim. The Kohen is Tameh, he can't eat truma, but his property has the right to eat truma. So the Gemara says that's different. And we're going to have a few steps here. We'll have 3 steps to try to narrow down what exactly is the problem when we say that you cannot give the power to eat truma unless you have the power yourself. The Gemara says here it doesn't count, because this is just like the Kohen's mouth hurts. You can say his mouth hurts, so that's why he's not eating. Therefore, he can't give the right to eat truma. He has the right to eat truma. He just has something temporary or something non-essential, non-integral that's blocking him. Like if he had a sore tooth. So the same thing as if he's an Arel. The fact that he's an Arel, that means he doesn't have a bris milah. That's an outside thing that's blocking him. If he's tummy, it's an outside thing that's blocking him. He still has the innate right to eat truma, and therefore he can give that to his property. That's different than the case of the eved of his wife, who she doesn't have the right to eat truma because she's a chalala, cannot give that right to someone else. Gemara says no, but I'll show you a case where even someone who has no right at all and never will have the right can give the right to eat truma, and that's if a woman has a son from a Kohen who's a mamzer. In that situation, the mamzer can never eat truma himself. A mamzer is not allowed to eat a truma, but this mamzer does give his mother the right to eat truma, even though she's a bas Yisrael after the death of her husband, the Kohen. So there you see that the mamzer gives the right to eat truma, even though he himself has no right to eat truma. So the Gemara says, okay, so we'll narrow down further. It's got to be that the relationship which creates the power to eat truma exists. If there's something faulty in the original power to eat truma, that's where the power can't be given further. The case here, the woman is a bas Yisrael. She has no shaykhs to truma. Her only shaykhs to truma is through her marriage to a Kohen. Well, that marriage is voided from its ability to give the rights to eat truma because she's a chalala. She's married illegally. That's why she cannot take that power further. The power never comes to her in the first place. The mamzer is different. The mamzer is a Kohen. He doesn't have the right to eat truma because he's a mamzer. But as the child of his mother, she has the right to eat truma based on his existence. All right, this is all the Gemara's first answer, that the reason that the eved of the wife, who is nichsei malug, does not eat truma is because his owner, the woman herself, does not eat truma. The Gemara has a second approach. The Gemara brings Rava, who says that really midaraisa, she does give the right to eat truma to her eved if he's nichsei malug, even if he's nichsei malug. The problem over here is that there's a gzeira d'Rabbanan. The Rabbanan min gzeira, they wanted this woman to want to leave the marriage. They wanted her to say, hey, I'm being treated like a zona here. I don't eat truma. My eved doesn't eat truma. Obviously, I'm not really part of this estate. If so, she'll pick herself up and leave. And because it's an illegal marriage, we want her to make that conclusion, and we want her to leave. The Gemara has no challenges for that. The Gemara brings a third approach, which is Rav Ashi, and he also says that the problem here is the Rabbanan, but he says it's a gzeira. We're afraid something else is going to happen. What are we afraid? We're afraid if we let the woman's eved eat truma, so what will happen after her husband dies? The eved will continue eating truma. He said, hey, I ate truma up till now. Why should anything be different? I should continue eating truma. And he does not realize that he can't eat truma. He thought he got the right to eat truma from his master, who is the wife of the Kohen, but that wife no longer has any relationship. That wife never had the right to eat truma. He was eating truma because he was the possession of the estate of the Kohen, but he is no longer the possession of the estate of the Kohen because the Kohen died and his master, the wife, is no longer the wife of a Kohen. Now, the Gemara says this can't be correct. Because if this was correct, then any bas Yisrael should not give the right to eat truma. She should not eat truma herself, and she shouldn't give the right to eat truma to any of her possessions for the same reason. After her husband dies, if she ate truma before, she'll continue eating it. She'll think I'm allowed to, and it's not true. So the person, no. In that case, there's no gzeira, and you're right. In the simple case of the woman who's a chalala, there's no gzeira either. The case here is where she had a long history of eating truma, and that's as follows: she was a bas Kohen, so she ate truma when she was born. Then she married a Kohen. Now she continued eating truma, this time because of her husband, not because of her father. Then her husband died. Now she continued eating truma because she went back to her father's estate. Then she married a Kohen Gadol. Now she becomes a chalala. Now she loses the right to eat truma. She can no longer eat a truma. However, she notices that her eved can continue to eat truma. So she says, hey, my eved ate truma all this time. She doesn't understand why, if her husband dies now, why should the eved change? He ate truma. Her eved ate truma when she was single, when she was married, when she was widowed, and now when she's married again. So even if she becomes widowed a second time, she doesn't see what the difference is. And she'll go, therefore the eved will continue eating truma, even though she can't, because now this is different than her first widowing, where she was a bas Kohen. Now she's a chalala. She doesn't have the right of a bas Kohen at all anymore. So the Gemara says this works only in a situation where it was a bas Kohen. What are you going to say if it was a bas Yisrael? You won't have this. So the Gemara says the Mishnah doesn't differentiate between a bas Kohen and bas Yisrael because of a low plug. We always make a general rule for all almanas, and therefore we say that halacha keeps in all situations. All right, now the Gemara has concluded its discussion of eating truma. The Gemara now goes on to the general rule of nichsei tzon barzel. Nichsei tzon barzel, again, was property which belongs to the husband during the marriage, and he has to return it at the exact value in which it came into the marriage. So the Gemara wants to know what happens if she says at the end of the marriage, when they're getting divorced, she says, I want my exact kli back. She brought in a sewing machine, and she says, I want the sewing machine itself back. I want the property returned. I don't want the monetary value. Even though it belonged to him during the marriage to some extent, I want the monetary value. She insists she wants the kli itself. She doesn't want the value. Can she demand it? Or does the husband have the right to say, look, it's mine. I promise to give you the value back. I'll give you the value back. So the Gemara says the machlokes is between Rav Ami and Rav Yehuda. Rav Ami says he has a right to decide what he wants to give her back. He can give her back the value. Rav Yehuda says no, she has a right to insist she wants the kli back. What's the reasoning? So the Gemara says Rav Yehuda's reasoning is because it's her family property. She has a right to take back something which belongs to her family. It's a family possession. She wants it back. She has a right to say that. Rav Ami says no, it belonged to the husband all along. Since it's his, he can give her back what he wants. Now, the Gemara says you can apparently prove something about that subject from our Mishnah. Our Mishnah made it clear that while they're married, the Eved, which is Nichseis Barza, belongs to the husband. How do you see that? Because the Eved was allowed to eat Truma. Okay, so then he's the property of the husband. If he's a property of the husband fully, then she has no claim. The husband can decide what he wants to do. So Gemara says, you're understanding the Mishnah wrong. He was never really the full property of the husband. He was guaranteed to be returned to the wife at the same value. It was the husband's responsibility. The husband took the risk of gain or loss. He was what's called the husband's responsibility. The husband was responsible to return the property at the value in which he received it. That's why he has the right to eat truma, because responsibility gives the right to eat truma. When a Kohen is responsible for the Eved, responsible to maintain the value of the Eved, that gives the Eved the right to eat a truma. However, he was not really the full possession of the husband. The Gemara says, is this correct? Responsibility gives the right to eat truma? I'll show you that it's not correct. What happens when somebody rents a cow? So the renter has responsibility for the cow. The renter has to return the cow if he's stolen or lost. The cow goes back to the owner, and the renter has the responsibility. Yet the truma eating ability of the cow goes with the original owner, not with the renter. If a Kohen rents a cow to a Yisrael, even though Yisrael has responsibility for the cow still has the right to be. You may feed the cow truma grain, truma animal food, obviously, but truma food. On the other hand, if a Kohen rents a cow from Yisrael, even though the Kohen himself is eating truma, he may not feed truma animal food to the cow because it belongs to a Yisrael. And the fact that he has responsibility for it does not mean that he can feed it truma. So the Gemara says you're making a miscomparison. So the kasha here is that this shows that responsibility does not create the ability to eat a truma. It's ownership that does. Therefore, in our Mishnah where the Eved had the right to eat truma when he was nichseis barzel, it must be because he was owned by the husband, not because the husband had responsibility for him. So the Gemara says it's not correct. In our Mishnah, he had full responsibility for him. In your case of the cow, you only had a partial responsibility for him. In the case of the cow, if he would lose value or if he would gain value, that loss would be the responsibility of the owner, not the renter. The renter does not have full responsibility. If he would die or weaken the cow, that is, the responsibility for the loss would be with the owner and not the renter. The renter does not have full responsibility as the husband does for the avadim. If you want to compare it, you have to compare it to the case where a renter takes responsibility for all loss, for all gain and all loss. He says, I'm going to evaluate the value of the cow at the time that we begin the rental, and I will return it at the same value no matter what. That's comparable to the case of the Eved, where the husband has to return the Eved at the same value no matter what. As a matter of fact, in that case, the ability to eat truma does follow the halacha of the renter, just like we're saying applies in the case of the husband and the Eved. There, the renter, if the renter is a Kohen, he has a right to feed the cow truma, animal food, and if the renter is a Yisrael, he cannot feed the cow truma, animal food, even if the owner is a Kohen. So you see that the ability to feed truma does go with responsibility and not necessarily with ownership, just like we've been saying all along. Okay, now what is the halacha? Is the halacha like Rav Ami, that the husband can choose to return what he wants, or is the halacha like Rav Yehuda? So the Gemara says that at the end of the year, Rav Nachman, Rabban, and Rav Yosef were sitting together, and they said there's a brisa that goes both ways. There's a brisa like Rav Yehuda, there's a brisa like Rav Ami. The brisa like Rav Ami is the halacha is that an Eved who has his eye or tooth knocked out by his owner goes free. So an Eved of Tzon Barzel only goes free if the husband knocks out his eye or his tooth, not if the wife knocks out his eye or his tooth. That clearly shows like Rav Ami, he's the property of the husband, not the property of the wife during the marriage. On the other hand, we have a brisa that supports Rav Yehuda. The brisa says that if a woman brings in evaluated property to the marriage, that is Nechseis Barzel, what we are discussing here, the husband is not allowed to sell the property. Even if the husband gives his wife a gift of property at the time of the marriage, and he gives it to her as a gift and makes it the status of nichsei tzon barzel, the husband may not sell the property. That clearly shows he doesn't own it. If he owned it, he should be allowed to sell it. Now the Brisa there continues, and it says that if either one of them sells it, was an incident that happened, what's the halacha then if they do sell it? That case came before Rav Shimon ben Gamliel, and he said the marriage is canceled. Whether the wife is dead or alive, whether the marriage is being ended or not, the sale is canceled. The sale is canceled. The sale is void because the one who sold it did not have the right to sell this property. Now, let's continue trying to figure out what the halacha is. So we have a brisa going each way. So the Gemara says, Rava said to Rav Nachman, the halacha is like Rav Yehuda. That is, Rava said in the name of Rav Nachman, the halacha is like Rav Yehuda. And Rava himself asked Rav Nachman, why should that be so? We have a brisa that supports Rav Ami. So the Gemara said, even though Rav brisa supports Rav Ami, the Gemara ignores the fact that Rav brisa supports Rav Yehuda as well. The Gemara says Rav Yehuda's logic is unassailable. It's her family property. It's originally her estate. She has a right to demand back something that has familial significance. Now the Gemara brings a case. The Gemara said that there was a woman who brought a very valuable cloak into a marriage, and it was nichsei tzon barzel. It was part of the ksuba. It had to be returned at the end of the marriage. Then what happened was that the husband died, and the inheritors, the Yisomim, took the cloak and used it as a shroud. They draped it over the mace as a shroud. Now the halacha is that the shroud of a mace becomes like hektish. It becomes aser b'hana. It cannot be taken as value to anyone. So it's as if they were makdish it. They made it hektish. So she said, hey, I get my shroud back. So the psak that was given by Rava was that no, it's a shroud, it was hektish, and she doesn't get it back. The shroud was aser b'hana. By being used as a shroud, she no longer has a right to get it back. So the Gemara says, why should this be? But we said that halacha is like Rav Yehuda, that it's her property. She has a right to demand back the actual thing if she wants it. So the Gemara says, yes, you're right. She has a right to demand it back. However, it was just a shibud. It was just an obligation to give it back to her. It wasn't in her possession. She had a shibud. She had a right to collect it. Until she got it back, she didn't actually have it. She had a right to get it back. The rule is that a right to get something can be canceled if it becomes hektish. And the Gemara shows that Rava says there are three ways to cancel the right to get something. Even if you have a legal lien on an object, you have a right to collect the object. If that object becomes chametz on Pesach, or if it becomes hektish, or if it's an eved that goes free, and therefore there's no longer any value to this possession, there's no longer a possession, the one who had the shibud loses the right to collect it. You cannot get that object anymore because that object is now non-existent. It's disqualified. So that's what happened over here. Now, she can get the value, of course, but she can no longer get the object here because she cannot. She had a lien, and she can no longer get that lien. Now the Gemara brings one more case. The Gemara says, what happens? The Gemara quotes Rav Yehuda, who says a halacha. He says, what happens if she brings two kalim into the marriage with a total value of 1,000 zuz, 500 each. Then they both double in value. Now each of them is independently worth 1,000 zuz. So the husband just has to return to her one of the kalim. One of these kalim is worth the amount that she deserves to get. It was nichsei tzon barzel. She gets back 1,000 zuz worth. The increase in value belongs to him. He gives back one of the kalim. The Gemara says, though, that Rav Yehuda said she has a right to say, I insist on getting back both kalim, and I'll pay you the extra 1,000 for the second one. So Gemara says, what's the chiddush? Rav Yehuda already said she has a right to take the kli. Gemara says, the chiddush over here is that she's not just getting what was owed to her and insisting on having that in kli form. She's getting additional value beyond what was owed to her, and she has a right to demand, since it was her kli, she brought into the marriage, she has a right to take back even more than the original value, because it was, according to Rav Yehuda's svara, it's her family's estate, and she has a connection to it, and she wants it back.